Hi, welcome back to the Working Class New York Revisited Conference. I'm Steve Breyer. I teach labor history at the School of Labor and Urban Studies, and it's my pleasure to introduce Martha Biondi, the moderator of the third panel at the conference, which is on Black and Puerto Rican movements in New York City. Martha is a professor of African American Studies and History at Northwestern University and the author of two important books, To Stand and Fight, The Struggle for Civil Rights in Postwar New York City, published in 2003, and The Black Revolution on Campus, published in 2012. Martha.
Thank you very much, Stephen, for the kind introduction, and welcome everyone to the panel on African American and Puerto Rican social movements in post-war New York City. I will introduce the panelists and then offer some remarks before we take audience questions. I am delighted to take part in the symposium honoring the pioneering scholarship of Josh Freeman. In rereading Working Class New York for this event, I was reminded not only of its brilliance, but how engaging it is. It's a model of rigorous but highly accessible history writing. But what's most impressive is Josh's command of his subject. He really has an unsurpassed understanding of the details and complexities of New York City politics, finance, demographics, labor, housing, healthcare, and education, all of it. It's truly my honor to be here today, although for sure, I wish we were together in person to raise a glass of champagne and toast you, Josh, but someday soon. Okay, the panelists for this session are extremely distinguished, and it's my pleasure now to turn to introduce them. First up is Aldo Lauria Santiago, a professor of Latino and Caribbean Studies and History at Rutgers, an historian of Latin America and the United States. Dr. Lauria Santiago is the author or editor of numerous books and articles, including Rethinking the Struggle for Puerto Rican Rights and To Rise in Darkness, Revolution, Repression, and Memory in El Salvador, and Landscapes of Struggle, Politics, Society, and Community in El Salvador. He is currently writing two books, one on Puerto Rican workers and work in New York City from 1918 to 1970, and the other on 19th century peasants, coffee, and mestizaje in Eastern Mexico. Next up is Brian Purnell, the Jeffrey Canada Associate Professor of Africana Studies and History at Bowdoin. A prolific scholar, Dr. Purnell has authored numerous essays and books, most notably Fighting Jim Crow in the County of Kings, the Congress of Racial Equality in Brooklyn, which won the New York State Historical Association's Dixon Ryan Fox Prize, and with Jean Theo Harris of The Strange Careers of Jim Crow North, Segregation and Struggle Outside the South. Dr. Purnell is currently writing a narrative history of Black people in Gotham from 1613 to the present, tentatively titled The Capital of Black America, New York City's African American History, 1613 to the present. Third to speak today is Lashawn Harris. Originally from the Bronx, Dr. Harris is an associate professor of history at Michigan State University and assistant editor of the Journal of African American History. The author of numerous articles and essays, Professor Harris's first book, the 2016 Sex Workers, Psychics, and Number Runners, Black Women in New York City's Underground Economy, won the Organization of American Historians Darlene Clark Hine Prize for the best book in African American women's and gender history. And it also won the Philip Taft Labor Prize from the Labor and Working Class History Association. Lashawn is currently writing about police violence and its aftermath in New York City. Our final speaker this afternoon is Joanna Fernandez, an associate professor of history at Baruch College and author of the fascinating recent book, The Young Lords, A Radical History, which is a history of the Puerto Rican counterpart of the Black Panther Party, which was published in 2020 by UNC Press. The OAH, the leading professional organization of US historians, just awarded it three major book awards. This is an extraordinary recognition of her achievement, and so big congratulations, Joanna. Professor Fernandez is the author or editor of many other publications, including Writing on the Wall, Selected Prison Writings of Mumia Abu-Jamal. And with Mumia Abu-Jamal, she co-edited a special issue of Socialism and Democracy titled The Roots of Mass Incarceration in the US, locking up Black dissidents, and punishing the poor. So each panelist will speak for about 15 minutes. So thank you again for joining our panel this afternoon. We're excited to have this very important conversation with you all. So turning now to Aldo.
Greetings, and thank you for the introduction. I will be presenting on an ongoing work that's a little rough, some ideas and some images associated with the work on the fight for white collars and hard hats, or alternative title, civil rights or labor rights. And it's all about Puerto Ricans and economic struggles, broadly defined, sometime in the early 60s, right? First, I'd like to congratulate Joshua for his accomplished career and for inviting me to this conference. Absolutely wonderful event. Just want to explain a little bit my relationship to the book, since this is a lot about the book. I had been reading archival materials on Puerto Ricans for a few years after shifting to do New York research after years doing Central American and Mexican work. And at some point I realized I had to do, get to know the history of New York more broadly. And I started with Italians and African Americans, and then bigger histories of the city. And then I remembered a book that my dad had mentioned when it came out. And so I stole his copy of the book, and it was Joshua's book. Joshua placed Puerto Ricans in the story, in many stories. So I began a debate with the privilege of having absorbed the kind of more empirical archival material from different archives first, especially chapters 9 and 11. In his book, there's one of the few discussions that provides extensive presence to Puerto Ricans, which is much appreciated. So this chapter in particular, I chose it because it's in dialogue with a lot of the things that he discussed in those two chapters. The book puts discrimination and civil rights struggles based on ethnicity and race in larger discussions of class politics, and that's also a very valuable contribution of the book. His approach validated what I was finding in the archive, that Puerto Ricans were in the thick of all major and many, many minor working class struggles. So lesson was that I should have read his book earlier, but okay, context to this material. Puerto Ricans were about 11% of the population in the city, depending on how you count. Third generation Puerto Ricans, which existed, are not quite counted here, so the numbers are a little incomplete. There's multiple generations, early migrants, more recent migrants, and a firm, large second generation. And most people of Puerto Rican descent were not recent migrants in 1960. Puerto Ricans were overrepresented, so to speak, in manufacturing and in industrialized services. That's a term I think I invented, but it refers to places that are like factories, large cafeterias, hotels, etc. Right? So that maybe 50%, and there's different estimates for this, and this is for the late 50s, Puerto Rican workers are unionized, which is, it's a union city, but Puerto Ricans were not excluded from unions for the most part, except some of them, right? This is a context of growing pressure on the city and state anti-discrimination establishments, which have a long history at this point, to take action on multiple issues. And this work builds on a few other scholars, right? This is, I'm going to zoom into the images as you see them, just to give you a better sense. This is just to illustrate that Puerto Ricans were in Manhattan, in the Bronx, Brooklyn, and so forth. This is, a lot of people are not familiar with the density of Puerto Rican settlement. And like I said, in 1960, 10, 11, maybe or so percent of the population of the city. So the work is premised on the massive campaign against exploitation of the late 1950s, which Joshua mentions in his book, and nobody had ever done any research on this. So I went deeply into that. I have a whole chapter on that campaign, and that intersected Puerto Ricans with the labor movement around the fight for unionization and also the fight against mob-controlled, racket-controlled unions, right? And in this context, the labor movement was the principal but not the only source of leadership coming from within the Puerto Rican community. And as the 59 turned into 1960, coming out of that struggle, which I can't really give a lot of details on that because I don't have enough time, the movement, the alliance of organizations moved to a model, and I think this is what makes it especially important, a larger broad-based movement to raise people out of low-wage work that was social and not specific to one particular plant or factory, right? And the labor movement is bringing this idea into various spheres of alliances, and I'm going to, mention some of those as I go along, right? In my work, I sort of have found that labor movements were critical to the formation of Puerto Rican leaders and organizations and civil rights struggles. So there's an intersection and a quite complex intermingling that I'm still trying to figure out between leaders that come out of unions and the creation of Puerto Rican specific organizations. And the premise, the premise as well as the argument is that Puerto Ricans benefited from alliances with African-American groups and leaders in rich, complex ways, and that had its moment and then sort of fizzled and moved on, right? The broader questions have to do with how Puerto Ricans organize for economic demands within and without working class movements, leveraging their own forms of organizing. How did race and ethnicity manifest? And this is not something I can get into, how Puerto Ricans saw themselves as a race or ethnicity in these anti-discrimination demand-making campaigns. How did they understand their alliance with African Americans? And the super complex piece of the alliances with working class labor movement institutions, and then working within the framework of liberal politics and liberal institutional frameworks, especially in the city, right? Okay, let me skip that one. One of the things, the part that is least well known, is that there's quite a maturing of Puerto Rican organizations as of 1960, and these are the important players. There's hundreds of labor leaders coming through the unions all the way since the 30s. Some are actually getting ready to retire. That's how dense it was. So a lot of my work is on recovering their histories and their trajectories and who trained them and what did they do and so forth, to the point where they organize a semi-clandestine Hispanic labor caucus of leaders meeting at night quietly to kind of, well, whatever. I can explain that in Q&A if you need me to. The Migration Division, an office that was established by the government of Puerto Rico. It's a branch of the Labor Department, but it was run, especially by the mid-50s, as kind of a community organization with many heads and functions. But its director, Joe Montserrat, became one of the most important civil rights leader in the community, providing resources and leadership, including to unions and the parts of these stories that interact with the labor movements. The Migration Division had helped create the Council of Puerto Rican and Spanish American Organizations, which is a council of representatives of dozens of organizations. And at this point, there's like hundreds, a few hundred of Puerto Rican organizations of different sorts in the city. This is kind of like a flourished moment that's going to maybe kind of simmer down in the 70s a bit. And out of this comes the National Association for Puerto Rican Civil Rights, which is founded mostly through the efforts of labor leaders, Puerto Rican labor leaders, right? So these are the campaigns that I look at, and I'm just going to tell you a little bit about them and illustrate them a little bit with some documents. But they all share the intersection of the social, not a specific place of work, except maybe a little bit with the hospital workers, but that was very social as well, the way it was handled. And also the realization, and this is the Puerto Ricans converging with the labor movement and the Central Labor Council, that unionizing factory by factory was not going to work, would take too long, that the city needed a minimum wage, that the city needed to fight for state and federal minimum wages that provided a decent living wage. So initially, there's this work that's done within the unions through the Central Labor Council, the Civil Rights Committee work. Then there's a campaign, and many of these things are happening at the same time, but the intersection of Puerto Rican groups with African American groups, with Central Labor Council, et cetera, occurs with all of these in different ways, right? The minimum wage campaign to have the city have its own minimum wage, which is eventually struck down, and then questions of the state, the struggle to help the hospital workers unionize and gain good contracts, the struggle over ILGU, the Garment Workers Union, and discrimination within, Dubinsky's plantation, access to higher paid jobs. And this is a lot of what will eventually become part of affirmative action work, but it's very precocious. It starts in the late 50s. It has to do with bank clerks. And there's some amazing stories of Puerto Rican leaders meeting with bank executives to say, so what are you going to do here, right? In 1962, or that kind of thing. Hotel workers, again, Puerto Ricans had been in hotel work, African Americans not so much. Together, they were demanding more kind of front of the house jobs, white collar jobs, higher paid jobs within this industry. African Americans were demanding entry because there's different levels there of participation. The city civil service, and this was more important to Puerto Ricans than African Americans, the entry into white collar or technical jobs within the city, right? And then the hard hats, the construction jobs. Each one of these is massive and worthy of a book. And, there's some literature, that's extensive literature on these. And I'll just talk a little bit about the construction jobs. Martha, how much time do I have left? Roughly. Okay, I'll keep going. You can tell me.
Yeah, I think about 5 minutes.
Okay. Construction jobs started, especially with places of construction that had public dollars, including 2 big hospital complexes, and then the World's Fair. And the Joint Committee on Equal Employment Opportunity, what it called itself, was basically Montserrat and Philip Randolph working together and then mobilizing the resources, and I mean work, printing flyers, press conferences, meetings, that kind of stuff, to demand construction jobs, right? And here, Brooklyn Core, we have the expert in the house, it was intersecting with these efforts, right? And Puerto Ricans joined in some of them, including aggressive picketing, but they wouldn't join in blocking traffic, for example. And the critical entry piece here is apprenticeships that are controlled by unions, not by employers. The city is pushed to do all these investigations. Some results, this is another kind of worms, how much do all these struggles in the early 60s yield? The hospital workers are mobilized by Montserrat and Philip Randolph. Hundreds and hundreds of people from the Puerto Rican community come out to participate in the pickets, right? And then the plumbers and electricians have their own, each one of these is a different lawsuit or different struggle or different picket line. The sheet metal workers get sued. The plumbers are on the border of getting sued to accept Puerto Rican and Black plumbers into the union. The electrical workers, the IBEW, which is led by Van Arsdale, who's also the head of the Central Labor Council, opens up more construction apprenticeships to Blacks and Puerto Ricans in this period. So there's different kinds of resistance, and some yield and others don't, right? And there's a lot of correspondence between all of these players, including the Jewish Labor Council, the Central Labor Council, the Workers' Defense League. The city is being pushed to create a program that will recruit youth, right, to enter into apprenticeships. So this is a flyer from the Migration Division's involvement. This is Joe Montserrat talking to the Paper Box Makers Union. This is one of hundreds of examples of 1950s engagement by the Migration Division. Here's Montserrat with a few labor leaders. Montserrat's the guy on the right. Uh, and I'm pretty sure this is Van Arsdale. I'm not completely sure. Joshua can tell me later. Armando Betance is just one example of Puerto Rican labor leader, started in the late 30s, getting his training, and he comes from hotel workers, local 6. The role of SCAD, and Brian will recognize this. Most people have never heard of SCAD, the State Commission Against Discrimination, but as part of the campaign against exploitation, Puerto Ricans start using SCAD in the mid-50s as a vehicle for labor struggle, and they're directed to do so. There are lawyers helping them and so forth. So this is part of the anti-discrimination establishment. How effective it was, debatable, right? The Central Labor Council, Civil Rights Committee. And why was this important? Because there's money, there's full-time activists, or there's labor involved in all of these offices. The same thing for the Migration Division. The Migration Division, for example, paid for the buses that went to the famous March on Washington in the early 60s quietly, so the Puerto Rican government wouldn't find out. This is the office of the Migration Division, and this is their industrial relations program, which is part of their employment program. And when you look at what Luis Cardona and Eddie Gonzalez are doing, they're out there basically labor leaders and civil rights leaders. So they push the borders of their official work, just like Montserrat did, once they are out in kind of movement mode. This is the Hispanic Society of the IBEW. It's one of the first formal Latino labor organizations within a union. Not the only one, not the first one, but one that was very well organized, in part because, and they were not all men, by the way. It started with factories, and then it moved to the especially men who were trained in the apprentices to do construction electrical work. Right? This is a Hispanic Labor Council, which gets formalized in 1969. It was a campaign, there was resistance, and to some extent, it had to do with the parting ways with the Black movement that took place within the Puerto Rican leadership. And this is from the fight for the minimum wage, for the city's minimum wage, and major campaigns in the Spanish press. You can follow all of this through the Spanish language press, just to see the level of participation. They're promoting demonstrations. They're saying at such a time tomorrow, meet up for the rally. And this is of the Federation of Hispanic Societies asking for support for the minimum wage in the Spanish-speaking community. And this one, I love this one because it's the headline says Martin Luther King will speak for the workers of the hospital, right? This is part of the hospital campaign, but the photo is Jose Montserrat, who was up there with him, right? And so this is a rally for 1199 Negro and Puerto Rican communities, support 1199, and obviously this is from the Spanish language press. Right? A flyer that this was produced by them, printed by the Migration Division for solidarity, Puerto Ricans to come out again for the same campaign, right? These are IBEW workers coming out, same campaign, 1199. The level of pride and solidarity and kind of cross-reference, after a while, you just have too many examples of the same kind of thing, is overwhelming. This moment is a moment of kind of rich intersectional mobilization, right? And it's supposed to be one chapter. So Martha, I assume I pretty much done. Okay, so I'll leave it there. And if you have any questions about this, I welcome them. Thank you.
Thank you, Aldo. And you can stop sharing your screen, and Brian Purnell will speak next. Brian, can you unmute yourself?
Yeah, it's Zoom, right? Like it wouldn't be a Zoom meeting if someone didn't do that. And I am happy that it was me, that it was I who did it. In the introduction to Working Class New York, Josh Freeman writes, quote, "I do hope that this book illuminates the possibilities for ordinary people to play a greater role in shaping their city and nation than they do today. So much of what made New York great came from their labor, their struggles, their jokes, and their songs. Forgetting that impoverishes us all." While 20 years later, the possibility of working class priorities guiding national policies remains aspirational, Freeman's second point, that working people's culture, politics, and history enriches the city, that point stands as true today as during the twilight years of the 20th century when Freeman wrote and researched Working Class New York. New Yorkers involved in mid-20th century civil rights movements attempted to shape their city and their nation. Their labor, their struggles, their jokes, their songs worked to improve New York City's social and economic life, especially for its Jewish, Black, and Puerto Rican residents. While Black social activism does not serve as the primary focus of Freeman's book, post-war struggles for civil rights and African-American New Yorkers' politics occupies significant space in working class New York. Freeman's synthesis history of post-war liberalism in New York City and the shifts in progressive politics and culture showed how Black protest and Black politics played vital roles in the city's diverse and changing left-leaning society. Working class New York did not participate in debates about whether Black New Yorkers' political concerns reflected social realities of class exploitation or social experiences of racism. History, especially of activists and protests, reveals that the answer is always both and, not either or. Black New Yorkers were and are central actors in post-World War II New York City's working class history. Civil rights and Black power political activism advanced and challenged post-war liberalism in the city. Working class history in post-war New York City includes the city's complicated history of racial tensions, divisions, segregation, and violence. Freeman's book synthesized all these themes. It helped usher forward important scholarship on Black social movements in Gotham. Martha Biondi shows in her field-defining book, To Stand and Fight, how during New York City's post-World War II years, the Black freedom struggle, or the struggle for Negro rights, as Black activists called it during the time period that Biondi writes about, involved comprehensive demands in all areas of city life: labor and employment equality, fair and affordable housing, equal protection, not over policing and under protection from law enforcement, equal and excellent public education, and political power. Biondi writes, quote, "Black New Yorkers fought for better jobs, an end to police brutality, access to new housing, representation in government, and college education for their children. Their battles against unexpectedly overt lawful racial barriers pushed New York City and state to pass landmark anti-discrimination laws in employment, housing, public accommodations, and education, laws that inspired similar legislation in dozens of other states and became models for national legislation." In the year 2000, when Working Class New York was published, a handful of scholars focused on civil rights movement in history in New York City. Few published studies that focused on the 19s and 50s and 60s existed. Most of the existing scholarship on racism and activism in New York City examined the Great Depression period or the Harlem Renaissance, and focused on activist politics in Harlem, the interracial and American-led left, especially the Communist Party, and policies that surrounded key moments, politics that surrounded key moments like the 1935 and 1943 uprisings in Harlem. A few books like Craig Wilder's on Brooklyn and Stephen Gregory's on Queens tackled the general history or sociology of racism in parts of New York City. One of the first books dedicated to civil rights activism in the city during the post-World War II period was Clarence Taylor's History, published in 1997, of the Reverend Milton Galamison, the Brooklyn-based activist minister who led the 1964 citywide boycotts against racially segregated public schools. Other than Taylor's book on Galamison, many academic histories of the Black freedom movement in New York City were available only as unpublished dissertations. Graduate students with inchoate plans to write local histories of post-World War II African Americans and Puerto Ricans and radical activism talked about the dissertations by Martha Biondi and Adina Back and Wendell Pritchett like they were underground mixtapes, desirable, fresh, and exclusive. As we fumbled around for historiographical guides on local histories of liberal left activism, the appearance between hardcovers of Josh Freeman's Working Class New York shined like a bat signal in Gotham's night sky. Fret not, wayward grad student, the book's deep synthesis said. The field of post-World War II New York City history has room aplenty for more work on civil rights protest and African-American activists. Freeman's entire book supplies a deep, rich synthesis of New York City's social history that serves as essential context for any study of political protest during the decades that followed World War II. Of the many topics covered in Freeman's book, a few themes from the history and the historiography emerge as central to any analysis of Black social movements in post-war New York City. So one theme involves demographic changes that occur in the city from the 1950s through the end of the 1960s. Put simply, the city's Black and Puerto Rican population increased and its white population decreased dramatically, right? But the numbers are just dramatic in these 2 decades of demographic shifts. The second theme from Freeman's book centers on the power and importance of organized labor to post-war New York City's politics, economics, and culture. Unions at the start of the post-war period were one of the most powerful and important political and cultural institutions in the city. That influence declined significantly in New York and the nation by the end of the 20th century. The third theme from Freeman's book encompasses the significance of the city's radical left, broadly defined, but especially the role that communists, socialists, and other critics of liberal capitalism played in an array of intellectual and political groups and institutions. In New York City, radical leftists were not uncommon. More than any other constituency, including liberal unions, religious institutions, and the Democratic Party, New York City's radical leftists made opposition to racism, or as they sometimes called white chauvinism, and racial egalitarianism, part of their purpose and culture. And the last central theme includes the widespread resistance to left liberal New Yorkers' promotion of social democracy from anti-communist cold warriors and less ideologically driven, but no less influential sectors of the city's conservatism. As important as liberal unions, Democrats, radicals on the left were to New York City's history of anti-discrimination and fighting racism, plenty of people in New York City wanted their racial or religious separation in their neighborhoods, schools, and workplaces. They never hid their views. They fought hard to protect their, quote, way of life. Now, Freeman's book, especially its 11th chapter, presents civil rights activism as quintessential to the city's working class history. Freeman writes, The civil rights struggles of the 1950s and early 1960s set the stage for the decade of extraordinary working class self-assertion that followed. Freeman, along with the other historians who in the early 2000s published a first wave of scholarship on civil rights activism in New York City, highlighted the widespread protests against racial discrimination in employment, schools, and housing. These were the three social issues throughout the Jim Crow North where racism consistently demanded activist struggles and where social life outside the South took on clear distinctions along lines of race and class. Along with Freeman's book, other important early studies emphasized this history. They helped create a dynamic subfield of histories on segregation and struggle outside the South. Clarence Taylor's study of Milton Glamoson showed how a radical socialist Presbyterian from Pennsylvania became the city's most outspoken critic of racially segregated schools, a champion of racial integration in public schools, and an organizer of interracial protest politics. Beyond these attention to the decade of struggle that ensued from the mid-1940s through the mid-50s added robust social movements against police brutality, Black New Yorkers organizing for political power in electoral politics, and early criticism of the toothless nature of the State Commission Against Discrimination. Adina Back's fantastic dissertation remains one of the most comprehensive studies of New York City's mid-20th century Jim Crow public schools. And Wendell Pritchett's case study of Brownsville's demographic transformation from white to Black traced the area's ascendant Black working class activism around early 1960s labor union civil rights protests, around mid-1960s rent strikes, and late 1960s community organizing around the war on poverty and movements for community control of public schools. Subsequent waves of scholarship on civil rights and Black power movements in New York City have expanded our knowledge of Puerto Rican protest politics, the emergence of community action during the war on poverty, the destructiveness of segregation and discrimination in public schools, the pervasiveness of police brutality, the rise and fall of interracial protest movements, and the significance and centrality of women of color in all areas of liberal, radical social movement organizing. The historical scholarship on Black protest and activism in New York City continues to grow in dynamic, exciting ways, moving back in time to uncover the long roots of Black New Yorkers' fights against racism, sexism, and class exploitation, and to trace the enduring legacies and unfinished work this history leaves in the present. Freeman's assessment on the significance and influence of New York City's struggles against racism reminds readers of this history's importance and complexity. Freeman writes, quote, post-war New York City had legally mandated, post-war New York never had legally mandated segregation. To the contrary, state and city laws passed during the 40s and 50s forbid various types of discrimination in housing and employment. But the lived experiences of Blacks and Puerto Ricans proved the limit of legal protection unaccompanied by the social will to enforce them and the hollowness of opportunities for those lacking the economic and social wherewithal to take advantage of them. For all New York's rhetorical commitment to equality and racial justice during the decades after World War II, patterns of occupational discrimination, school segregation, and ghettoization endured and deepened. That's a long quote from Freeman's book. That these problems remain endemic in the city's social life is a testament not to the shortcomings of the many social movements that arose to address them, but to the staying power of Jim Crow in the North. So thank you, Professor Freeman, for your work. Thank you for organizing this panel. It's really fantastic to be here and inspirational to talk about this important book.
Great, thank you very much, Brian. And now we will turn to Professor Harris. Can you unmute yourself, Lashawn?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Thank you to the symposium organizers for inviting me to be part of this wonderful celebration of Dr. Friedman's important scholarship, as well as his generosity as a scholar and mentor. Dr. Friedman's seminal work on New York City and the different ways in which ordinary New Yorkers lived, labored, and challenged urban inequalities has deeply influenced my own work in studying the interior lives of working class people. The title of my presentation today, and I would also like to thank the Walker family. Thank you for sharing your family histories with me, your memories, as well as your many pictures. The woman that you see on the screen, this is Sharon Walker, and this is another image of Sharon Walker, as well as her 3 children. The title of my presentation is My Mother Was My Everything: Police Murder, Slow Violence, and Family Loss. On Saturday evening, December 8th, 1984, Sharon Walker, a Jamaica Queens working class mother, and her 2 daughters, 17-year-old Kim and 16-year-old Crystal, gathered into the family car. Walker was dropping off her girls at her grandmother's home for the evening. While traveling to their destination, mother and daughters laughed and joked with one another and became a bit amused when they got lost trying to locate their grandmother's house. These precious moments of family love and pleasure were symbolic of the countless moments Sharon Walker shared with her daughters. Finally arriving at their grandmother's home, Walker parted from her girls, smiling at them, kissing them, and telling them, "I love you." Sometime after 1:30 a.m. on Sunday, December 9th, Walker got into a minor car accident with 56-year-old African-American off-duty NYPD Sergeant Rudolph Hayes. At fault, a drunk Hayes struck Walker's vehicle. According to Walker family friend Ronald Barnes, who just happened to be at the scene of the accident, Hayes brutally assaulted Walker. Hayes approached Walker's vehicle, dragging her out of the car and striking her in the face. Coming to Walker's defense, Barnes confronted Hayes, allowing a battered Walker to escape. In a matter of seconds, Hayes pulled out his gun and fired several shots at Walker and Barnes. A single shot struck Walker in the back. Hayes fled the scene, leaving a seriously wounded Walker, quote unquote, lying in the street. The woman who, quote unquote, everyone loved died at a Queens hospital. The next morning, detectives arrested Hayes, charging him with second-degree murder and attempted murder. Police violence not only killed Sharon Walker, the bullet that lodged in Walker's back also harmed those who loved her, especially her 3 children, Kim, 17, Crystal, 16, and Antoine, 12. According to scholar Kristen Smith, quote unquote, the bullets often associated with police killings symbolically ricocheted into the lives of the families of the dead, end quote. Families were also victims of police brutality, suffering slowly and long after relatives' deadly encounters with police, and long after media headlines and local justice committees. The Walker children's heartbreaking loss is far too common. Children like the Walker teens have long been uncounted victims of police brutality. They often became collateral damage when law enforcement used deadly force against their parents. The police killings of Sharon Walker and other Black parents raises questions about the impact of police brutality on families, particularly those on children. And these are some images of children who have lost their parents to police brutality. Gianna Floyd of George Floyd, who was killed in 2020. This is Philando Castile's daughter. Philando Castile was killed in 2016 in Minnesota. This is the children of Walter Scott, who was killed in South Carolina in 2015. And this is the daughter of one of the daughters of Arthur Miller, who was killed in New York City in 1978. The police killings of Sharon Walker and other Black parents raises questions about the impact of police brutality on families, particularly on children? How did children cope with the aftershocks of parental death and police violence? And how did their lives fare in the days, months, and years after their parents' deaths? Such stories are important in exploring how anti-Black and state violence shaped Black childhood, as well as demonstrates the broad range of human suffering and loss. This presentation briefly examines the impact of police murder on children. It uses the tragic 1984 murder of Sharon Walker and the lives of her 3 children to explore the quote unquote lingering after effects of police terror on the bodies of the living. Moreover, this presentation explores an understudied aspect of the struggle against police brutality. This was a struggle that was not waged in New York streets, nor was it a struggle waged primarily in a courtroom. This was a working class family struggle fought beyond the public gaze, one that was fought in the Walkers' modest Jamaica Queens home. Police brutality shook the Walker children to their core. The family experienced what scholar Rob Nixon calls a slow violence, a violence that is not explosive, visible, or spectacular, rather a form of violence that is gradual and veiled, delayed in destruction, and a sort of violence that slowly unfolds across time, space, and place. The slow violence that plagued the Walker family left a lifetime of heartbreak, compelling them as children and later as adults to face painful and uncomfortable realities and cling to survival strategies that altered the trajectory of their lives. Thrust into new circumstances after their mother's death, the teens struggled to maintain their personal lives. They experienced socioeconomic difficulties and contentious family dynamics. At the same time, the fallout from police violence distinctly affected each sibling. Maternal loss produced personal hardships, including clinical depression, feelings of isolation, substance abuse, and entanglement with the nation's carceral system. The sudden and tragic death of their mother set into motion a series of life-altering moments for the Walker children. Their lives slowly unraveled days, months, and years after the crime that shattered their family. The bullet that killed their mother gradually took its toll on their lives, patiently dispensing devastation that was far from public view. The oldest Walker teen, Jamaica High School senior and single mother Kim, assumed the role of primary caregiver for her siblings. With limited assistance from adult family members, the book-loving 17-year-old went from solely caring for her young daughter to also mothering her 2 siblings. Kim took on the daily rigors of household work or household management, attempting to maintain some semblance of family stability. She made sure her siblings attended school, she cooked and cleaned, and she served as endless support for her siblings. Household and parental responsibilities made it difficult for Kim to grieve her mother's death. Meeting the day-to-day emotional needs of her family while striving to maintain an outward image of domesticity and strength, Kim privately grieved. She mourned the loss of motherly love, she mourned the loss of her best friend, and she mourned for the person who would not be present to share insights about womanhood and motherhood. While struggling to manage care work, Kim lacked access to public and private therapies needed to address stresses and anxieties caused by or exacerbated by police violence. In a 2018 interview with Democracy Now! Host Amy Goodwin, Erica Gardner, political activist and daughter of 2014 police brutality victim Eric Gardner, discussed the much needed yet costly mental health services that many working class victims of police brutality do not have access to. Quote unquote, how do regular families deal with it? For families that's put in my position, Black families that's on public assistance that don't have the income to get therapy for $300 an hour. How are we supposed to cope with it if we don't have someone to talk to? Because this is trauma, end quote. Like Kim, Crystal struggled with their mother's death. She quote unquote lost her whole self after her mother's murder. For the pleasure-seeking teenager, the aftershocks of police violence produced severe mental health conditions, including a nervous breakdown and temporary memory loss. Long after their loved one's death, deadly encounters with police, many families experience emotional numbing, suicidal thoughts and attempts, and other psychological distresses. Crystal's mental health challenges spoke to the impact of police brutality on survivors' bodies, minds, and spirits. Speaking on her mother's death, the now Queens College undergraduate student and grandmother recalled that several years of her life were a blur. Some of Crystal's memories as an adventurous teen and grieving daughter are difficult to recall. Quote unquote, I have no memory of my life between when my mother died in 1986, the year my son was born. Testimonies are not always feasible for victims of traumatic events. Heroin incidents potentially complicated the possibility of publicly or privately disclosing such experiences. Coping with family loss, Crystal turned to narcotics, developing a substance abuse problem that she bravely battled throughout the late 20th century. Crystal's addiction challenged the Walker household. The middle daughter physically and emotionally isolated herself from loved ones and abandoned parental duties. But her siblings, remembering maternal lessons about family commitment and love, never deserted their sister. A crippling drug habit did not deter Kim and Antoine from supporting Crystal. Their unwavering love appeared in the form of hugs and kisses, words of encouragement, and raising Crystal's children. Police murder distinctly impacted Sharon Walker's youngest son, snatching away his childhood and creating a maternal void. The fun-loving, green-eyed 12-year-old Antoine had a special relationship with his mother. Always wanting a son, Sharon spoiled her youngest child, catering to his childhood desires for motherly affection. Describing the emotional toll of his mother's death on his life, Antoine noted that, quote unquote, she was my earth, soul, and rock. I kept thinking that she was going to walk through the door. It took 2 or 3 years to realize and understand that she was gone. Antoine struggled to, quote unquote, find his way without his mother. Parental homicide ushered Antoine down a path neither he nor his mother could imagine. Several years after his mother's murder, a teenage Antoine entered New York City's flourishing drug economy, becoming a savvy street entrepreneur and peddling an inexpensive new drug, crack cocaine. Hitting New York streets sometime in the early 1980s, crack cocaine was one of the city's largest employers. Rock cocaine offered aspiring teens the opportunity to realize dreams of financially caring for their families. For Antoine, New York's drug economy offered individual economic uplift and a chance to play by his own rules. However, visions of creating personal economic wealth were short-lived for the Queens native. Sharon's youngest son found himself entangled in the nation's carceral system. In 1992, 19-year-old Antoine, while residing in Massachusetts, was convicted and sentenced to prison for drug distribution. Legal confinement not only impacted Antoine. According to Kim, her brother's incarceration was something akin to, quote unquote, a death-like loss. It was devastating. It was like losing another family member. Amid personal struggles, the Walker family painfully observed how New York City's criminal justice system failed to hold their mother's killer accountable for her death. The family's hope for legal justice faded as the assailant dodged substantial prison time. In May 1985, a Queens grand jury indicted NYPD officer Rudolph Hayes on murder, attempted murder, and second-degree murder. In June 1985, a Queens Supreme Court jury found Hayes guilty of second-degree murder. Hayes received a sentence of 5 to 15 years, serving only 2 years at New York's Auburn prison before his 1987 appeal. That year, the appellate division court overturned Hayes's manslaughter charge, essentially freeing him. Hayes's legal fate left the Walker family heartbroken and frustrated with New York's legal system. The legal ordeal emotionally brought the siblings back to December 9th, 1984, the day their mother was murdered. They believed their mother was being killed all over again. Lack of legal accountability gave the impression that Sharon Walker's murder was unworthy of legal retribution and reflected the legacies of an exclusionary politics of protection for Black women like Sharon Walker. Moreover, the decriminalization of Hayes's crime harmed the siblings. The long drawn-out legal drama murdered their souls again and contributed to the ongoing slow violence that plagued their teenage lives. And this image right here, I forgot to mention, this is the funeral program from Sharon Walker's funeral. And these are her 3 children. So this is Kim. This person right here is Crystal. This is their dad. And this is Antoine. And again, these are scenes from the funeral from the New York Daily News. And these are current pictures of the siblings. More than 35 years after their mother's 1984 killing, the Walker family seeks to bring visibility to their mother's story. Inspired by contemporary Black activists' efforts at shedding light on Black women's often overlooked experiences of police violence, the siblings in 2020 started an online petition to quote unquote honor Sharon Walker's memory with a street sign on the block where she was brutally murdered. We are asking the community, neighbors and friends to rally behind us to rename the street on 106th Avenue to Sharon Walker Way. In telling their mother's story, Kim, Crystal, and Antoine also imagined disclosing personal accounts of family loss. Complicating conventional discourses on police brutality, the siblings envision revealing, to borrow from activist Sabrina Fulton and mother of Trayvon Martin, quote unquote, the devastation and pain and the bottomless heartbreak left by state-sanctioned violence, as well as the irreversible damage police violence has on Black children.
Thank you, Lashawn. We move now to Joanna Fernandez.
Can you hear me? Yes, yay, okay. First of all, thank you for the invitation. Thank you to the SLU for organizing this. It's an honor to be part of this distinguished panel. All of your work. I mean, how do we do this without each other's work, right? It doesn't happen without each other. So, so really, I want to thank all of you for this work that we do, which is not easy, but it is gratifying. Okay, so I think it seems unbelievable that until the publication of Josh Freeman's Working Class New York, which was published at the start of the 21st century, the written history of New York after World War II was pretty much a wasteland. And I remember when the book came out, first of all, I just pulled the book out of the woodwork today. And I don't, for whatever reason, I don't put my names on books, but I put my name on this book. It says right here, Joanna Fernandez. I need this book if I'm going to finish my dissertation, so no one can take it. I remember devouring the first chapter of this book with delight, and the first chapter is titled A Non-Fordist City in the Age of Ford. And in this chapter, Freeman showed that even though manufacturing was in decline in New York, manufacturing was still a central feature of New York's economy. He also showed that New York manufacturing outfits, like New York manufacturing factories, had an advantage in New York. And that's because the vastness of New York meant that a lot of what was produced here was also consumed in the city. And as I was looking through the book and looking at the things I had underlined, I was reminded of the recent strike of the Hunts Point workers at the Hunts Point market. This was a large strike of over 1,000 workers. These things are rare these days. And one of the things that kept on coming up is that market was critical to the whole New York City area because it provided produce to this area during the pandemic. So again, the vast character of the population in the New York metropolitan area gave these manufacturing companies or factories an advantage because they were producing on a large scale for consumption on a large scale locally. And part of what we learn is that New York had more manufacturing jobs in this post-war period than Philadelphia, Detroit, Los Angeles, and Boston put together. And he tells us that apparel, printing, and publishing, and food was the anchor of manufacturing. But, you know, we also learned that manufacturing is a smaller percentage of working class employment in New York because it's in decline. We also learned that New York City manufacturing is idiosyncratic. And that's because it's composed mostly of a very large number of small manufacturing plants numbering about 25 workers a factory on average. And we also learned that half the manufacturing establishments in New York had 10 workers or less. So a very different picture is emerging, he explains, when we look at New York City from the national manufacturing picture, which was dominated by significantly larger plants. So we learn a lot more, but essentially the detail of New York that we learn about in that first chapter, its working class, what makes New York distinct from other cities, is something that we hadn't really seen in one place ever before, especially not of this period. And for me, part of what this meant was that after at least 2 decades of postmodernist influences in the academy, Dr. Freeman was bringing back the notion that material conditions, in particular, the production of all goods and services, which constitute the wealth of society, and the notion that the relations of production between workers and their employers are foundational for how we understand history and society. This analysis of workers and their importance and production that seemed so far removed from the academy was back. And I was incredibly excited for my own work and for trends in the academy, but also because I'm from New York and a number of you folks are from New York. And part of what the book allowed was an understanding of our city, right? This global understanding of how New York came to be, at least modern New York, contemporary New York, a global picture of how New York came to be what it is. I also remember, and I underlined this quote here. So this is also on the first chapter. He's talking about the working class, where the working class works, and the idiosyncrasies of the manufacturing industry and its small character. And then he says, at the other extreme were the tens of thousands of neighborhood groceries, butcher shops, vegetable stands, pharmacies, and candy stores, many tiny family operations. What C. Wright Mills called the lumpen bourgeoisie, earning at best a modest income by working physically exhausting and emotionally deadening hours and exploiting their own family members. So if you're from New York, of that epoch, right? Because New York, it seems in the 1990s, started to become an outdoor mall. But before the 1990s, New York was this eclectic city with all these small shops and businesses that didn't always have good relationships with the community. In any case, I remember reading all of this and it gave me life. We got a dynamic and a sense that the working class was both dynamic and contradictory, that in the post-war period, the working class is racially and ethnically diverse, it's cosmopolitan, and he informs us that that's a product in part of the working class proximity to the ports of New York, which are so important. We get a sense that there are unions here with large Black and growing Puerto Rican workers in terms of membership, that there's this activist, socialist, and communist and left tradition in the unions, but also that unions are insular and parochial, at least some of them are, and that they're racist and exclusionary unions. And essentially, the book showed us how an organized working class expanded access to housing and healthcare and fought for decent wages beyond what was available to other workers nationally. And of course, one of the major arguments of the book is that the New York that we know as liberal New York is what it is because of its working class and its organization. And I remember reading a section of the book about union-run healthcare centers and their origins in New York, which helped me personally integrate and contextualize my own experience accompanying my father to what he called the union doctor. My father was first a super of a building in the Bronx and then a janitor of a big building in the Bronx. And he was a member of 32E, of local 32E. And so I remember reading this book and thinking, oh, Jesus, well, here is this history of unions in New York, which in 2000 was essentially esoterica, right? It's the unions. No one knows what happens in the unions because there are so few of them. And the academy, perhaps, the professoriate. These are two institutions in American society that nobody knows anything about. How do you get a PhD? Unclear. What happens in a union? Got no idea. And this book, I mean, for me, with a father who was in the union, he wasn't necessarily an active member, but he believed that unions were important. And I accompanied him to the union office numerous times. It was just so important to read this book. But the book also explored how the demographic expansion of Black Americans and Puerto Rican workers in New York and their struggles against discrimination in employment, for better housing, and against racism in the schools gave working class struggles in New York a new lease on life in the 1960s. We also got to read about the emergence of the public sector unions, another very confusing area of history, and also the new activism and labor organizing in the hospitals. And so I probably don't have a lot of time left, but I just want to talk briefly about how the book influenced my own work. I wanted to write a history of the Young Lords, the Puerto Rican counterpart of the Black Panther Party, and the 60s movements that was in conversation with political economy. I wanted to understand, is there a relationship between the rise of the Young Lords and the Black Panthers and their politics and what's happening on the ground in the city economically? And this book helped me understand the transformation of New York, right? The transformation from manufacturing to service, this contradiction in the New York economy, that it was both expanding in the post-war period, but contracting. I was like, okay, how is that happening? And who are the winners and who are the losers? And at some point, I remember, I haven't found it, I remember that he said at some point, well, Puerto Ricans who are the new migrants and Black Americans who are migrating from the South, they're entering into the declining sectors of the economy. In one sentence, all right, yeah, that makes sense. And this is producing a permanent poverty, a distinct kind of poverty. So I also wanted to understand in my work why the Young Lords and these 60s radicals of color are so focused on issues of health. Like when you think of revolutionaries and radicals, you're not thinking about lead poisoning and like mortality. And yet radicals are hugely oriented around issues of health. And without the very important scaffolding that this book did, I would not have been able to write the book I wrote, right? So I think we are all indebted to Josh Freeman. Just my dissertation, this of course appears in my book, but my dissertation was hugely political economy. It was like all political economy and the Little Young Lords. I wanted to understand the lumpen proletariat, like why the obsession with the lumpen proletariat on the part of the Black Panthers and the Young Lords. And I remember looking at the footnotes of Josh Freeman's book and I saw Bureau of Labor Statistics. Well, why don't I go and look in there and see what I find there? And there it was, that in 1966 and 1967, for the first time in the history of the city, in New York, there is an emerging class of permanently unemployed people, unemployed for over a year, who've abandoned any hope of getting a job. And Puerto Ricans are disproportionately represented in the young folks who are permanently out of the labor market, who, by the way, the Young Lords and the Black Panthers are calling the young cats in the corner. And so I'm just so happy that this book was written when it was written, because it made me feel that I was not crazy, right? That there was this thing called the economy and the working class and demographic change and migration, and that these things intersected with racism and white supremacy and race and police brutality and discrimination in the schools. And here you had a book that beautifully and elegantly put it all together and made it accessible to broader audiences. Elegantly written, filled with detail that's funny sometimes, but also this analysis that hangs on the political economy of the city and its transformation. That's it. I know I'm probably over. I just also want to say that I took a class with Josh Freeman at Columbia when I was a graduate student there. And I remember like going to his lectures and being like, all that detail, all that analysis, no notes. He's not reading his lecture. And he sounds like us. I want to be like that when I grow up. So we all need models to follow. And it's emotional to look at a professor's life at the end of his career, although this is not the end of your career, and to see all the ways in which you've enriched our understanding of this incredible city, but of American history, generally speaking. So thank you, Dr. Joshua B. Freeman, for being like the working class historian who represents for the working class of New York. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Johanna, for those very moving words and for that wonderful presentation. I want to thank all of the panelists really for their very rich insights and reflections. I'd like to invite audience members to submit questions now. We will begin the Q&A in about 10 minutes or so. And before I offer remarks related to the theme of the panel, I'd like to say a word about the influence of Josh Freeman's scholarship and teaching. I was lucky enough to have him as a professor in graduate school at Columbia. Having Josh's courses on US labor history in the curriculum decisively shaped my cohort at Columbia. Obviously, we all took up a range of topics and went in a variety of directions, but Josh's imprint on all our work is clear. His teaching and scholarship encouraged me to center the Black working class, to engage unions in a complex way, as extraordinarily important vehicles of working class organization and political empowerment, but also sometimes as instruments of racial and gender exclusion. Josh Freeman pushed us to dive into the contradictions and to create rich, nuanced portrayals of workers in whatever setting we were studying. Turning now to the theme of the panel, my remarks today are not going to be a traditional comment, but an effort rather to bring a fresh lens to post-war anti-racist social movements. I'd like to offer a reading of anti-racist struggle during the era of Freeman's working class New York that's in conversation with contemporary analyses of racial capitalism on the one hand, and advocacy for police defunding and abolition on the other. As we know, these two concepts and visions shape progressive and left outlooks in our own time. Let's take working class Harlem as our vantage point to think about the horizon of anti-racist theorizing during the heyday of working class New York. I argue that many activists in that era articulated an analysis and critique of racist capitalism. They sharpened and extended analyses from the 1930s, forged in a moment of capitalist crisis, most notably in W.B. Du Bois's seminal Black Reconstruction. This approach was intensified in the 1940s with the advent of two phenomena: the growing numbers of Black workers joining unions and the deepening of the organized left, most notably, but not only in unions and in Black communities. But in contrast with today's abolitionists, anti-police brutality activists in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s sought to use rather than disavow the state apparatus. Arguably, though, their thwarted efforts to seek redress at every turn exhaustively laid the preconditions, the crucial groundwork for contemporary abolitionist demands. First, let's examine the extent to which post-war Black anti-racist activists and organizers conceptualized racial capitalism as the problem and offered solutions that went beyond what we tend to think of as liberal or market-oriented civil rights strategies. I argue, in slight contrast to working class New York, that the second Red Scare did sideline a more robust confrontation with racial inequality than would follow in the labor movement in the era of Cold War liberalism, with the important exception of the surviving left unions like District 65 and 1199. After the sidelining of the left in the union movement and in electoral politics, the Democratic Party pretty much settled in with so-called de facto segregation. In the 1940s and the early 1950s, there was a strong organized left in the New York City labor movement and Black rights movement, which encouraged attention to political economy and attention to seeing a fundamental entanglement of race and class. Crucially, left-led unions facilitated a new kind of Black leadership outside of the usual network of civil rights professionals and clergymen. These unions generated Black leaders with a strong working class consciousness and working class base, including ones Will Jones mentioned earlier today, such as Ewart Guinier and Eleanor Golding. The second Great Migration of the 1940s and 50s gave New York City the largest urban Black population in the world. And the fight for good jobs for Southern migrants became a top priority, especially in the aftermath of the intense labor mobilization of World War II. Black trade unionists understood that non-white labor, and especially non-white women's labor, had long been surplus, casual, underpaid, and super exploited. The war emergency had created new conditions of scarcity that reconfigured the region's labor market. And so after the war, the Black left and the labor movement spearheaded the idea of affirmative action. They understood that union seniority systems would lock in white male racial preference, absent an adjustment to take into account the broadening of racial and gender occupational recruitment during the war. They basically failed, but their insights were influential, even if their advocacy in the labor movement was not. While unions had dramatically uneven records of Black and brown inclusion in leadership, some, like the transport workers, Local 1199, District 37 of AFSCME, and District 65, did enable working class Black New Yorkers to acquire job security, pay increases, and pensions. A union contract turned out to be a much surer way to ensure upward mobility than a barely enforced civil rights law. The Red Scare removed many of the most militant advocates of Black workers' rights from organized labor. It also sidelined the fight for full equality, so that when the push for social democracy in New York reached its heyday in the 50s and 60s, Black workers and families did not get their full or fair share. They did benefit from many of the achievements of working class New York, such as rent control, public housing, mass transit, and public hospitals. But persistent racial segmentation or exclusion in the housing market, workplace, and unions undermined their full inclusion in the city's bounty. But to be sure, working class Harlem and working class Bed-Stuy continue to organize to resist the logics of racist capitalism on the streets, campuses, and workplace. As a result of their experience of racial capitalism, Black workers and their advocates sought solutions outside of simple integrationist scenarios. Black activists shared the ambition of the broader working class movement to create a social democratic city. But with their deeper experience of private sector exclusion or super exploitation, they became particularly strong proponents of expanding the public sector and public sector unions. They advocated for a federal policy of full employment, for community cooperatives, for price controls, even a maximum income, robust trade unions with Black and brown leadership, and a robust government role in the provision of housing, including middle-class housing. Black health activists, including the Black Medical Association, also supported a socialized healthcare system. But in contrast to the white leaders of working class New York, many of whom were big supporters of the Southern Civil Rights Movement, sent busloads to Washington, working class Harlem and working class Bed-Stuy championed creative and robust measures to desegregate the metropolitan economy, residential, and educational landscape. The lived experience of working class Harlem and working class Bed-Stuy gave many of their activists a more complex understanding of the interrelation of race, class, and gender. The most visionary of them spurned colorblind logics, seeing race as constitutive, not outside of so-called free market capitalism. As others today have asked, we might wonder to what extent New York's Black rights movement was exceptional in its social democratic worldview and critique of racial capitalism. Perhaps they were able to achieve more in New York, like working class New York in general, for a time, but similar conditions and organizing traditions imbued Black organizers in cities like Oakland, Detroit, and Chicago with worldviews that also set them apart from the dominant strains of organized labor in their cities as well. So now I will turn briefly to the question of policing, and we'll take your audience questions in a couple of minutes. Anti-Black violence by police forces has been a mainstay of urban life since the Great Migration redrew American demographics. But were post-war anti-police violence activists abolitionist in their analysis or demands? Generally, no. Although they share the abolitionist view that public funds were much better spent on healthcare, housing, and social services than policing. Otherwise, I would say their efforts at mid-century focused on reforming the system. Activists in working class Harlem pursued countless remedies to hold offending police accountable, calling for special prosecutors and increasingly federal intervention. Frustrated in their efforts, they fought against police immunity from prosecution, filed civil suits, and demanded civilian control of police. The more radical groups ultimately began to stage community trials when it became clear that grand juries would never indict white police for the killing of Black people. Ultimately, the Civil Rights Congress appealed to the United Nations to see racial terror in the United States as genocide. Finally, after a couple of summers of Black uprisings over police violence nationwide, including New York, began to tear at the fabric of urban peace, Mayor Lindsay tried to create a civilian complaint review board. The police union immediately mobilized to undermine it and led a successful ballot referendum to repeal it in 1966. Thus, in the middle of a decade of massive urban unrest, sparked in almost every city by a police shooting of an unarmed Black person or other alleged police brutality, New York voters repealed a civilian complaint review board. The police union's long history of racial animus undergirded and shaped their campaign and brought into sharp relief their fractured relationship with Black and brown communities in New York. Very importantly, anti-police violence activists in working class Harlem and working class Bed-Stuy fought to broaden US constitutional rights to state criminal procedure in order to strengthen the rights of people in police custody. Known as defendants' rights, these rights included the right to counsel, the right against self-incrimination, and the right to due process in search and seizures. Grassroots activists pushed for states to embrace the US Bill of Rights years before the Supreme Court began to require that states do so in the 1960s. But as we know, the rollback of defendants' rights has been a core aim and achievement of the conservative remaking of the federal judiciary. Sadly, the political achievements of working class New York did not transform policing for Black and brown New Yorkers. As Lashawn Harris's work on this panel today shows, anti-Black state violence in New York City has left a trail of trauma in its wake. Well, on that note, I'm going to conclude my remarks. And again, I want to just honor Josh for his work, thank him for his incredible teaching and scholarship, and move now to some audience questions. We have about 15 minutes left in this panel. Okay. So here's a question for Aldo. What were the relationships between Puerto Ricans and other Latinx communities as those communities grew in size?
Yes. As of, it depends on the decade, right? In the late 30s, and the book that I have coming out, I called the Hispanic Popular Front, the coalition of different Spanish-speaking people, where Puerto Ricans were the majority, but not a absolute majority. There were many other Spaniards and Cubans and so forth. Later on, the period that I'm talking about now in the presentation, there's Cubans, some Mexicans, and some South Americans and Central Americans, but within these movements, they are kind of working within a Puerto Rican umbrella, and also obviously sharing neighborhoods. So in all of these spaces and organizations, there's a couple of people who were not Puerto Ricans, including the Hispanic Labor Council as well, who had an important Salvadoran origin leader, I should mention. So very quickly, I can say that. Right.
Oh, thank you very much. And so there's another question that I think could go to Joanna or Aldo or both, ideally. The question asks us, the panel, to talk a little bit about Herman Badillo and how, as the first Puerto Rican-born U.S. member of Congress representing New York, he was able to bring a voice, a Puerto Rican voice, on the national stage. What were his accomplishments of notes? What were his shortcomings? And especially his actions during the activism and efforts of the Young Lords and their various quote unquote offenses when he was in office. So Herman Badillo.
Go for it. Go for it, Aldo.
Okay, really quickly. There's different stages to his life, and in the period that I'm covering, the early 60s, for me, he's more interesting than when he became more of a kind of a national, congressperson. And in the campaigns for hospital workers, against police abuse, in the context of Puerto Rican riots, different episodes of the early to sort of late 60s, Badillo is in there with people that had formerly been associated with the Communist Party, for example, in coalitions. I think that will change as his position changes. But in the 60s, at least, he's one important leader among others. And that gives him leverage. His path gives him leverage between the organizations and City Hall, which is an important transaction in all of those movements. So.
My understanding is that a lot of the Puerto Rican elected officials or appointed, there were quite a number of appointed Puerto Rican officials in the 1960s, appointed by Mayor Lindsay. Like there was a Puerto Rican section of government that was very new to his administration. They supported the Young Lords silently behind the scenes and understood the significance of this kind of public-facing militancy that was not popular in city government. And they couldn't take a public position, but they silently supported the work of the Young Lords and even offered funding on the low. So that's what I've got on that.
All righty, thank you very much. So there's a question that I think everybody on the panel could take a stab at, and it's really asking to what extent the working class Black and Latinx movements of mid-century were autonomous from unions and political parties, and whether these arrangements were by necessity, by exclusion, by choice. So what was the relation between some of these movements and the kind of, political parties and unions? Were they happening inside, and via political parties and unions, or were they outside of them? And if anybody would like to take that. I think they're happening everywhere, and it's both and,
Yeah, I when I read that question, I thought of Lashawn's first, book, which is. Why you shake your head? No, I did, because that book is all about Black women advocating for themselves as members of communities, as heads of families, as workers, and it's all completely outside of mainstream institutions. And in fact, I mean, they're actually like targets of repression by especially the police and, kind of middle-class moral establishment. But that is an earlier period than the post-war period, but I like Professor Harris's book for the way that it addresses this question with a longer time view and from a view of people who are advocating for themselves and trying to move in multiple directions, but not not only without institutional affiliation, but also with deep institutional suspicion and repression. But to Professor Biondi's point, right, like a fascinating aspect about New York City as a historical place to do this research is you can see people like Benjamin Davis, who is a member of the city council, Black elected official from the Communist Party from Harlem during the Great Depression. And you can also see people like Bertram Baker starting a political lineage in Brooklyn, in central Brooklyn, as an elected official in the state assembly, but really doing it in opposition to the established democratic machine, laying a foundation, though, for someone like Shirley Chisholm to become a congressional representative from central Brooklyn, the first Black person to represent at that time in the late 60s, well over 400,000 people who didn't have a congressional representative because of the way the Democratic Party sliced and diced the district. So, it depends where you're looking, when you're looking, but I mean, that's a long way to give some examples of what Professor Biondi said. Like it's everywhere it's inside, it's outside, it's moving around in a circle, and all the time too.
And also workers who are outside of traditional work or formal work or unions who create really diverse ways of networking amongst themselves too, right? So, kind of taking a page from, antebellum, mutual aid societies and economic societies where workers and workers are getting together and, providing for each other too. So in some sense, you do have, informal laborers who are part of, these types of kind of formal wage, not unions, but organized platforms, but those who kind of take it upon themselves because they are excluded from white labor unions to kind of form independent, quasi organizations that kind of speak to their own socioeconomic needs, whether that's for, life insurance, funeral burials, aids to families who aren't doing well within the community, and also addressing issues that are pertaining to the, things that are happening to them as workers, both within the informal economy and also within the formal wage economy.
And if I can maybe channel Clarence Taylor here for a minute, like I think if we look at the mass protests in New York City in the 1960s, the mobilizations around education, first for desegregation early in the decade, and then community control, later in the late 1960s. I think that what we see basically is that the mainstream labor movement and the Democratic Party had failed to be vehicles of Black community, Black and Brown community, and parents' aspirations for their children, right? So early in the decade, they're partnering with churches, with grassroots organizations, and I think that's the major theme, really, by the time you get to the 60s, is the sense that no, you have to work outside of the unions. The unions are, as we've been talking about all day, diverse, and there are some very important, progressive unions that become important vehicles, right, for Black and Puerto Rican aspirations, but many of them aren't. And so, so in the downstate protests, for example, right, people are putting their bodies on the line, literally in the roads, right, to just fight to be, to get jobs in the construction of hospitals and university campuses. So I think you're going to see a range of methods, but I think it's going to become very common to work outside of the Democratic Party and outside of unions, mostly through grassroots, neighborhood, the Young Lords, the Black Panther Party, churches for sure, in the 1960s.
And I think the workers themselves understand that these, institutions are not the end all be all and can't address all of their issues.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's important to mention 1199, right? 1199 emerges in 1959, 60, 61, 62 with a series of organizing efforts and strikes to organize the predominantly Black and Puerto Rican hospital workers. And it becomes a sole union, right? The sole union. So there's that very important struggle, which is no small potatoes, because it's a huge part of the working class in New York that sees itself as part of the working class, the organized working class. What's interesting about my own work and 1199 is that there's a coterie of workers disproportionately younger, who are employed in the hospitals, the public hospitals, who form the Health Revolutionary Unity Movement, who by the late 1960s believed that 1199 is not representing the best interests of working class people of color, Puerto Ricans and Black Americans, that they're getting shafted, that that the union is not opposing the war, right, and not fighting against racism robustly enough in the public square. So there is definitely a move toward organizing at the level of the community. But I'm thinking of Gilberto Gerena Valentin's work, who is a labor activist associated with the Communist Party, but working intravenously with the unions and also with the hometown organizations. These a network of organizations that form around the towns that Puerto Ricans are coming from when they migrate from Puerto Rico to New York, and these are pseudo labor organizations that are also community organizations. And what's amazing about the hometown organizations is that when the police brutality cases emerge in the early 60s that get a lot of attention, Gilberto Gerena Valentin mobilizes the hometown organizations, and they descend on the precinct on 96th Street, I think is precinct 100, and they literally occupy the precinct in a scene that is reminiscent of the Malcolm X scene in a previous period. So I think the picture is probably a lot more complex than we really understand, and there's both happening simultaneously, community and union.
Those are actually great words to end the panel on.
I'm sure Aldo has something to say.
It's okay. The Gerena Valentin example is right on. So
we got a couple of questions that just came in at the last second. Oh, did you want to add, Crystal? Lashawn?
No. I didn't want to add anything, but I forgot to say this at the beginning. And if we were ending, I just wanted to say congrats to Johanna for all of her awards. I wanted to say that at the beginning of my presentation, but your book is so great, and just congrats. It's so well deserved.
There a couple questions came in at the end that we didn't get a chance to direct, but one was about the contributions from Afro-Caribbean immigrants. So we haven't named that, but York Guinier, Shirley Chisholm. So, they're all over these movements, and especially in organized labor, electoral politics, community organizing. So that's a very important question, very important story. And there's another question about maybe what some insights for today, from some of the way some of these activists navigated anti-communism or repression that might be beneficial for activists today. But I think maybe the panels later today will also continue that conversation. We're technically out of time, so I want to thank the panelists. Again, celebrate Josh, thank Josh for all of his amazing scholarship, and remind the audience to stay tuned because we have a great roundtable on social democracy in New York and the nation that begins at 2:45 Eastern time. So take a quick break, but then come right back and the wonderful symposium will continue. Thanks again, everybody.